Thanks so much, Mildred, for that very kind introduction. It's great to be with you all today. I will now try to quickly summarize this review. There's a summary and there's a much longer version online, but just to give some key highlights of this review, which synthesizes learnings from projects that were funded by the UN Trust Fund that adapted in response to both internal and external challenges and changes. These include things from environmental to political challenges to conflict and, really on a lot of our minds for the last few years, the adaptations in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. So at the heart of this review, I was really involved in compiling and synthesizing the insights that practitioners have shared and documented from 9 civil society organizations and women's rights organizations working to prevent violence against women and girls across 12 different countries. And the projects for this brief were selected because grantees had significantly adapted their projects due to changing circumstances. As you can see on this map, the projects worked across 12 countries, including 4 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, 4 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, 1 country in Western Asia, and 1 in the Pacific Islands. So we really have a diversity of contexts, and the organizations themselves are also represent a diverse range of NGOs, including local, regional, and international organizations that were working to prevent different types of violence against women and girls. Next slide, please. So I want to just draw attention to the conceptual framework that was used to organize the findings for this brief, and that will also organize this presentation. So we drew on the local adaptive capacity, also known as the LAC Framework, and this has been developed by the Overseas Development Institute and aims to explain how adaptive capacity can be supported at local level. So rather than just focusing on why projects adapt, it's really looking at, well, how do they adapt and how do they adapt well, and what does it take for projects to adapt? So this framework identifies 5 interrelated characteristics underlying adaptive capacity that are common to most contexts. So the first here on the left corner is knowledge and information. So this refers to the ability implementers have to collect, analyze, and disseminate knowledge in support of what is an appropriate adaptation option in response to this knowledge and information. The second is asset-based. So this is actually the availability of assets that allow implementers to respond to changing circumstances. So these are things like financial or material resources. They also include expertise in the project team that allows an organization to adapt. The third is institutions and entitlements. So this refers to the ability of institutions, or really organizations, which is the focus of this brief, to be flexible and how they can also evolve to allow adaptation, or if they are more rigid and that prevents adaptation. The fourth characteristic is innovation, and this refers to the ability to foster experimentation and explore solutions to take advantage of new opportunities. And then the final characteristic, according to this framework, is flexible and participatory governance and decision-making. So this is the ability of implementers to anticipate and respond to changes, including around future planning and kind of governance structures. So we applied this framework to this review after analyzing the practice-based knowledge, as the data commonly identified what are the characteristics and factors that allowed these projects to adapt their programming. So next slide, please. So in terms of first asking why projects had to adapt, there were many external reasons identified where grantees had to adapt their projects. Several practitioners noted how environmental threats, such as floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, extreme weather conditions, and tornadoes. So many we kind of related these events that could influence implementation and require adaptation. For example, a few projects noted how heavy rains could hinder travel, especially if worked in really remote locations with dirt roads. And this could lead to activities or events being postponed or changed to remote delivery or different locations. In addition to environmental threats, many practitioners emphasize the political instability of their contexts, and this could require adaptation of intervention activities, including postponing activities or moving activities from in-person to remote delivery. And just example of some of the kind of political instability that some projects face, this included military wars, gang conflicts, state violence, or political uprisings, and occurred in many of the project contexts under review throughout their UN Trust funded grant and implementation. So next slide, please. Of course, a kind of major external challenge on everyone's mind, and that really came up from the data, is the adaptation required by the COVID-19 pandemic. And a common but often quite major adaptation was pivoting from in-person to remote formats because of restrictions on gathering or social distance requirements. Yet it could be very challenging for both participants and sometimes even practitioners to be comfortable with technology or who just did not have access to the internet. And some of these projects are working in very remote locations with limited internet access. And in a field that often relies on very intense face-to-face interaction between frontline workers and communities, there was a sense of how the pandemic could disrupt the very foundation of this programming. So for instance, practitioners in South Sudan working through schools were unable to reach young people when schools closed, and they were unable to adapt to online. And a common challenge caused by the pandemic, including for this South Sudan example, was delays, quite significant delays in some cases, to just implementing projects. Some practitioners reported that the pandemic fueled adaptation of the kinds of support that they offered to participants to try to reduce the impact of the pandemic. So for instance, in the aftermath of food shortage and economic shock, some practitioners pivoted to provide hygiene kits, basic food supplies, or livelihood activities to marginalized communities to really address the risk factor of violence, but through kind of meeting different needs and different kind of immediate needs. So next slide, please. So there were, in addition to these external factors, kind of beyond the control of organizations, there were also internal factors. So referring to either within staff and projects or within their relations with participants. And there were many internal factors that could also drive adaptation. So this included things like the capacity needs of partners, staff, or key stakeholders, and recognizing that these might be different than what was initially envisioned and having to then pivot programming to meet identified capacity needs. Some practitioners adapted projects in response to resistance or backlash. So they had to kind of stop and pause or make sure that it was safe to do so. And this also was a common reason prompting adaptation. Another internal factor that some practitioners noted was when they were working with many or a variety of stakeholders, they might need to reach different stakeholders differently, and so adapt to meet their various needs and priorities. And practitioners could also be prompted to adapt because they did not reach participants as they thought they would, either because of barriers to them being engaged or to sustaining their involvement over time, and that being different than originally envisioned. So overall, the practice-based knowledge really highlights that these organizations face numerous challenges in the course of their work to prevent violence against women and girls at multiple levels, and really demonstrates why continuous adaptation is really necessary. So next slide, please. I'm now going to focus on how programs adapted. We've really talked now about why programs adapt, and now looking at how programs adapt, drawing on that local adaptive capacity framework I introduced earlier. So in terms of knowledge and information, so many practitioners noted that understanding and monitoring their context was key to inform adaptive programming. And this included kind of ongoing reflections on, is the program design appropriate, the theory of change, the focus of the prevention work, etc. And doing so, kind of really being engaged and collecting knowledge and information helps ensure that the program is relevant and also can inform where a program might need to adapt throughout implementation. And many practitioners really emphasize the complexity of violence against women and girls programming, which requires organizations to be flexible. And this is not only kind of at the inception phase, but throughout implementation. So really being flexible that your project design, your beneficiaries, how you reach people might change throughout implementation. And this flexibility was fostered by listening to the needs and priorities of participants and being open to pivoting implementation. So where knowledge and information really was important as well. Some practitioners also identified that an important component of this knowledge and information to support adaptation is taking an intersectional approach. So tracking who a project is working or not working for, or who a project is accessible to ensure that no one is left behind. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned in the LAC framework, asset base is another key characteristic. And practitioners identified how flexible and core funding were really key to support adaptive programming. And this includes things like flexibility to change budget line items and activities. And in the case of significant delays to implementation that are outside the control of the organization, being awarded non-cost extensions. The asset base also includes the capacity of organizations to adapt, but also meeting the requirements of funders. And so we'll talk about some of the kind of implications for funders in the recommendations. Also, funding that is not flexible or comes with very stringent conditions could hinder practitioners' ability to respond to changing circumstances. Although the data suggests that women's rights organizations and CSOs are well placed to know when and how to adapt. So it's really critical that funders have flexible funding models for these key organizations. Next slide, please. So in terms of this component, assessing and responding to the capacity needs of key stakeholders and participants really was also identified to be a critical component of adaptation. And adaptive programming includes organizations being flexible regarding the stakeholders and or even the institutions they target, but also how they target them and how this may need to evolve over time. And the practice-based knowledge really demonstrated that women's rights organizations and CSOs are typically well placed to ensure communities are recognized and heard. And this is identified also in this LAC framework as an important component of adaptive capacity. And this was because many noted that they have very strong working relationships, or they're very embedded within communities and with key project stakeholders. Okay, next slide, please. In terms of innovation, so this is, as we mentioned, one key characteristic of the LAC framework, and it was quite interesting, although there were a lot of challenges, as I mentioned earlier, as a result of the pandemic. On the flip side, many practitioners noted how the pandemic fueled innovations that adaptation made possible. These included things like focusing on self-care and well-being of staff and participants, and also helping community members mitigate the risk of the virus, and in doing so, building further trust with community members because of responding to their immediate needs. As I mentioned, changing to remote or digital initiatives was a common innovative adaptation. For many practitioners, this was the first time working in this way. And some noted how this could allow them to reach a greater number of people, although also stress that it's critical to ensure that people can access digital forms of engagement and that these are also effective, and some really important lessons learned on how to do this effectively. And interestingly, some practitioners noted how learning to work remotely more effectively and be more comfortable can prepare organizations to work this way in response to future crises, and can then also be an important risk mitigation strategy. So although COVID was the kind of predominant cause of having to work remotely, other situations could trigger this, such as political violence or harsh weather conditions. And so learning to do so could actually be really important for responding to other potential risks. Finally, I think women's rights organizations and CSOs, given their access to knowledge and information and their kind of ability to pivot programming, were in a good position to respond to the pandemic. And I think this suggests the vital role of such organizations and supporting them to work in more innovative ways. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the final characteristic of the LAC framework, and this refers to kind of flexible governance and risk mitigation. And this was also identified as a critical component, given how precarious violence against women and girls programming can be, as identified by these experiences. And one kind of lesson learned was that WROs and CSOs should apply a long-term analysis to identify risks that could affect their work and draw up appropriate risk mitigation responses for when emergencies or threats occur so they're not totally taken off guard. Prioritizing safety of staff and participants and being flexible in terms of decision making. So from the proposal writing stage to throughout implementation, were also identified as important components of risk mitigation and adaptive programming. And finally, flexible decision making for organizations themselves was said to be supported through having embedded relationships with community members and key stakeholders and engaging in participatory planning and dialogue on program design and throughout program implementation. So next slide, please. So this review elicited a series of recommendations for both practitioners, donors, and researchers. So I'll quickly highlight the recommendations for practitioners, which are as follows. The first is the importance to apply a risk mitigation approach to plan for potential disruptions. As we can see, these are very common in this field and for these kinds of organizations. Secondly, assess and respond to ongoing capacity needs of staff and stakeholders, as well as barriers to participants engaging in programs. Third, ensure regular feedback loops to review and respond to findings from monitoring, evaluation, and learning processes, and that such knowledge is applied to action or to really inform the program. Fourth, be willing to foster creativity, testing, and innovation. These can involve a degree of risk, but they can also bring rewards and really important kind of trust building exercises as well. Fifth, ensure flexibility and openness to change project priorities or kind of who you're targeting and how you're targeting as you go along. And sixth, strengthen institutional capacities for adaptation. And I think all of this PBK really emphasizes that adaptation is a skill in itself and requires support and dedicated leadership from organizations. And next slide, please. So for donors, the recommendations are as follows. First, offer flexible and core funding, which can really support adaptive programming. Second, women's rights organizations and civil society organizations are particularly well placed to apply adaptive programming. And so donors should continue to prioritize funding these actors. Third, adaptive programming involves risk and requires a relationship of trust between donors and grantees and this kind of model of flexible funding, but also donors listening to what is happening for practitioners on the ground. Fourth, donors should encourage and fund significant and appropriate inception periods, as this is also really key as a platform for adaptive programming. And fifth, donors should allow time and provide safe spaces for grantees to share adaptation needs, including these kinds of both external and internal factors and challenges that can prompt adaptation. And finally, next slide, please. For researchers in the field of ending violence against women and girls, there are also a few recommendations. The first is to carry out research to better understand why violence against women and girls programs must adapt. And there is, there's a lot of evidence on adapting evidence-based models, but there's less evidence on why programs must adapt to things that are not planned, kind of circumstances that can change. And it's really important to better understand this, given how common it is and how much it can prevent or affect program implementation and quality. Second is to assess the characteristics and factors underlying the adaptive capacities and how to promote resilience of violence against women prevention actors, including frameworks like the LAC framework, but also just really assessing from a kind of grounded up perspective, what does it take to be adaptive for these organizations? And third, it would be helpful to conduct research on how programs adapt in different geographies and in different sociocultural contexts. We were really lucky to have this diversity of context inform this brief. And I think kind of better learning how projects adapt in different settings will further strengthen this field and this work. So I know that was quite a lot of information, so thank you for your patience.